Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 19th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige, the title being Frequent Periods of Inaction in War, remove it further from the absolute and make it still more a calculation of probabilities. The text follows. But the slower the action proceeds in war, the more frequent and longer the periods of inaction, so much the more easily can an error be repaired. Therefore, so much the bolder a general will be in his calculations, so much the more readily will he keep them below the line of the absolute and build everything upon probabilities and conjecture. Thus, according as the course of the war is more or less slow, more or less time will be allowed for that which the nature of a concrete case particularly requires, calculation of probability based on given circumstances. This seems in appearance a relatively easy paragraph, not much for its length, but actually only for the two periods that fundamentally make it up. And I've been struggling, I must confess you, I've been struggling a little bit to grasp the actual meaning of it that I want to get as correctly as possible. So it's just me being dumb if I make some mistake, but here even with the translation I struggled a little bit. So here from the title, actually let's start from there. We see that what's the general aim of this paragraph is to look at how war further distances it itself, I mean real war distances it itself from the absolute, and make war itself fundamentally this makes more itself still more a calculation of probabilities. So fundamentally what von Clausewitz is showing here is how there is a control and modifications that intervene in the act of war as an act of violence, as the military instrument, that fundamentally make it possible to reduce it or to make it become kind of closer to a kind of a mere calculation of probabilities. In other words, here now as you have read from the text, and if you remember the last paragraph that we have seen, von Clausewitz had been discussing how fundamentally the action of war is suspended often during real wars, for which there is a lot of time, actually the majority of the time of in war, in which the actual act of violence is interrupted, and so most of wars are actually characterized in their development in a standstill, in which the both sides look at what I have to do, and they start to calculate what happens. So von Clausewitz, going to the text now, is restating this. He says, but the slower, actually here it's adversative, but the sense is that he's providing with a reason for which after all it's not so bad that the act of war has this kind of delay at best and interruptions as well. He says, but the slower the action proceeds in war, the more frequent and longer the periods of inaction, so much the more easily can an error be repaired. So this is self-evident. Like, if the slower you proceed in a war, the more an error in its conduct can be repaired, because fundamentally you have more time to assess what is going on and to find a solution. Now, von Clausewitz here is not advocating for the lengthening of the action of war. Quite the contrary, we have seen it many times. We've said it many times. Von Clausewitz is actually for the quickest action as possible. So here he's not saying you should always run fast, because most of the times, guess what, you simply can't do it. But if you have to choose, really the best option is always to make things fast. The reason, well, it still has to explain it, but fundamentally the reason is that the more you wait, the more this brings to the consumption of energies. So independently from the outcome, that naturally should be hopefully favorable to you and not to your foe. The more action is delayed, and the more both the system loses energies. Naturally, there are certain circumstances in which, the more you wait, and the more you actually can wear out an enemy. Think about during a siege, when you besiege an enemy force that is doesn't have enough supplies. You want to starve him, and that's how it happens. But at the same time, in that case, you're basically delaying the action, saying, okay, maybe you can have all the reasons. You may not have enough forces to storm that fortress, for instance. There are many. This is not important. We're giving it theoretically in general, but at that point, you're effectively still being consumed yourself. So von Clausewitz says, if you really can make to storm that fortress, for instance, without excessive losses, you should at least make take into consideration how much that assault would cost compared to what it would cost on the long run, keeping that siege, for example. So that you can't simply say, okay, well, we besieged the guy because he's just, we will starve him. That you still have to take into consideration that an assault, for how dramatic at the same moment can be, etc., might be an easier solution. Now, this is just a very banal example, so I don't. Von Clausewitz doesn't absolutize this, because, in fact, he is interested in giving, in not giving a single direction and a manualistic approach to war. There is nothing like that. There are situations that can, be have completely different solutions. And you have always, as a good commander, to know about which ones they are, because that's fundamentally, that's in a nutshell what your commanding abilities are not really all about, but also mostly about, because you have to assess also the means, the reconnaissance of the assessment actually of your own forces, or not just the ones of the enemy. So it's something extremely complicated in many ways. And that's why war is so difficult, and why there is never a single, there is hopefully always the best solution, but we may actually not know it. Excuse me, I threw a bag out of the way because it was bothering me. But the point made here is that, yeah, it may seem at least that an error can be repaired more easily the slower war is, because it's fundamentally a matter of assessment, right? Whereas when something happens too quickly, there might be actually a more chaotic evolution of the situation in that specific moment. But at the same time, this kind of decay of the system, of the structure, even of your army, gets worn out, etc., may be as complicated and as threatening as the consequences of just a brutal attack. But we'll see how von Clausewitz advocates the tendency towards action later. Here the point he's making is it follows in here. It says, therefore, so much the bolder a general will be in his calculations, so much the more readily will he keep them below the line of the absolute, and build everything upon probabilities and conjecture. So this is fairly clear. This is what the phrase that initially gave me a bit of trouble, but I think now interpreted correctly, because it says fundamentally that a general is bolder in his calculations, the more he will maintain himself close. Here it says below, as if it's like backing off, but it may seem like that, but at least I didn't translate it like that. To me, it's now the closest it is to the line of absolute. So that and it says, and build everything upon probabilities and conjecture. Now this is particularly important because here it's the absolute that comes back. Von Clausewitz, that is always talking in not really on on two tracks. Mm? From one side there is the absolute, which is how tendentially war should be fought. You know, what are the major directions that fundamentally the war action should take in order to achieve the result of compelling the enemy to fulfill your will, fundamentally. But at the same time, it says, you know, there are so many things, so many factors that intervene to weaken the tendency towards that absolute, that we have to be aware of them, because that's in its remnants, fundamentally, that real war is effectively fought. In reality, it is actually fought in reality. So here, the concept is that a general that tends towards the absolute, so that kind of tends to unleash his forces immediately and to act immediately, and therefore to shorten even the length of the action, therefore making it quicker, because probably he has a more powerful motive that dictates that. So here it is also a matter of feelings, naturally, as we have seen in the equation that von Clausewitz puts in terms of motives plus per force that brings fundamentally the power of the action of war. And the more this act is based on just on probabilities and conjecture. What does that mean? That when you have to act quickly, you have less time to sort things out, and therefore you have to rely on probabilities and conjectures, and therefore saying, you know, what are the odds? The problem now, and I think von Clausewitz explains this thoroughly, you know, as many other things now, this is just like what we have read up to now in our 20 videos on von Clausewitz, just the starter. Like, you know, we haven't even got into the midst of his theory. As we will see, the problem of assessing what sorting things out, let's say, is extremely complicated. So here he is still reasoning, kind of swinging towards the extremes, so to show you fundamentally what happens if, you know, the more war kind of gets intense and the more it kind of decreases, given the control and modifications that happen on it, to make you better understand what's the tendency that appears. Then, of course, in real war, things are paradoxically more homogeneous, or at least they tend to be more chaotic for you, in the sense that it's difficult, first of all, to assess what's going on, what the situation is, and to sort things out. So probabilities and conjectures actually are always there, and it's pretty obvious, it's kind of self-evident, that the bolder the general is, and the more things like chance fundamentally is you know, is what you surrender to. He surrenders to, meaning that if you don't really know what is out there, and still you need to act because there are pressing reasons for it, well, the bolder you are, yeah, sure, and therefore the more you have to rely on probabilities and conjectures, that is, fundamentally make an assessment with a consistent lack of evidence. On a consistent lack of evidence, and that is dangerous, naturally, and that's what makes you bolder. So then von Clausewitz says, thus, according as the course of the war is more or less slow, more or less time will be allowed for that which the nature of a concrete case particularly requires. Calculation of probability based on given circumstances. So, by rereading this last phrase, I think this is what was giving me a bit more troubles, but I think it's also clear now. So von Clausewitz is reinstating what we just said. That is, that war can be fought more or less slowly, it's on the speed that now von Clausewitz is focusing. It's not focusing on all the various aspects naturally can intervene to fundamentally decrease the evidence that you have in order to to build your plans in your action. Here's a matter of how fast it is, because it's kind of easier to understand. The speed here is a way to say, okay, I have less time to decide, and just to always look at the most practical phase of the story is that, I don't know if you have ever had to solve a tactical problem. It's something extremely complicated. Even if there are just a few variables that intervene on a given map, it's very difficult. And men like von Clausewitz, like Prussian, even a 16-year-old cadet Prussian academies, was able to solve some of these problems like in quarter of an hour, while most of us actually wouldn't probably even know where to start from in order to solve them. So this emphasis put on time is really something that they felt pretty much, because they had seen what the effect that more or less time can have on the conduct of war. Von Clausewitz obviously knew it. Napoleon was the one that said, I don't need fundamentally more reinforcements or more strengths or more supplies. All I need is more time. And time is indeed, I believe, also in all the rest of our lives, the most precious resource that we have, effectively, and we tend to waste it. This is also particularly important because it can be applied into war as well. I mean, that tendency von Clausewitz has been talking about in the previous centuries, in the previous paragraphs, sorry, is exactly this, that, yeah, you have some extra resources, like time, energies, etc., and you tend to say, okay, now I'm well off, I kind of lowered the guard. Well, that's the moment when you waste that. So von Clausewitz is always to keeping the guard high, saying, okay, let's tend always, not necessarily to the absolute for the sake of it, but let's always try to find the perfect balance, let's say, the golden section, interpoling our resources, our knowledge, and in fact what we're supposed to be doing, that is to oblige the enemy to do whatever we want him to do. And this is, in a nutshell, the great problem in the conduct of war. That the means in order to that you need in order to achieve your result are not just continuously changing, which is also a very important datum, but also they are by default actually not known in large measure, or at least they're difficult to assess. So in many ways, yeah, the slower war actually takes, the war action actually takes, the more you can sort things out. But at the same time, you will consume more resources, you will consume more energies, and at the end of the day, you will also achieve less, because given an inequality, a parity of resources, well, if you dilute this over time, well, you will have less effect. You will have a poorer use or weaker use of these resources, and always given that this system is continuously deteriorating by the laws of thermodynamics, we're all consuming energy that is spent and fundamentally will lead at a certain point to a sort of thermic death, because energy keeps being consumed. So also in war, this is always bringing to some kind of dramatic result. So either you get resupplied, reorganized, otherwise an army tears itself apart. So the more you wait, and the more these problems are evident. The more you wait, and the more, even in a battle, you realize the more your units get tired, disordered, and you also start lacking control over them at one point. So it is true. From the other side, a hasty decision can bring to to more bring to risk. It's inherently risky, because at that point you have to base it only on probabilities and conjecture. It might as well be that you can wait a freaking lot of time. You're still not getting better information about your enemy. That is also a problem, waiting for what? Because sometimes that's how you have to reason. You can't just be blocked by a lack of information into war. Because at that point, it's just about how importance you... It all depends on how much importance you give to such things. You always have to take a risk. We will see now from Clausewitz, not now, but in the following paragraphs from Clausewitz will talk also about the elements that make effectively war a game that has its measure of chance. It's a share of chance fundamentally. So there is always von Clausewitz will say that that war is, of all the possible games, is similar to a card game, because it has every element of that there is the human factor. It's probably most important, because you have the cards, but you still have to pick them. You have to choose them, which ones to play, and that's something that depends on you. So you may have kind of the best army in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, you may make a disaster. Then you have this element of probability that you fundamentally can't you have to take into consideration, because you always know that you don't have it. You can theoretically win, but at the same time it's particularly difficult to assess what other cards your enemy has, what what are the chances there's always a factor of uncertainty. This is the real point. You can never be sure before a card game that you will win. That's particularly important. But aside from this example, that we will address another time, let's say that you always have to take a risk, always, and this is valid even for life. I mean, it's very important to read the Vom Krige, because by talking about war, von Clausewitz actually makes very, very interesting points about the conditions of human, the reality of human existence fundamentally. What is that you do without risk fundamentally? But at a certain time, practice, experience teaches you how valuable, how acceptable, how runnable that risk is, how much worth something is to be put on the table, because otherwise you can't do anything effectively. You can't waste time calculating everything mathematically. It's impossible. You wouldn't leave at that point. So war is essentially like this. You can't be paralyzed by lack of knowledge. You have to act. Also because the action of war is always an instrument of someone that decides that action to happen. So war is fundamentally just a part of the actor's life. Let's say it can lead to the actor's death theoretically, but there are many it's like whether you decide to whether to go in at war or not, into a place where maybe your nation won't be destroyed, but it's still something can be drawing your resources pretty intensely. You have to know how to assess that, the risk, etc. And you can still kind of get yourself out of there if you can, and decide something else and going on with your life. This is a bit the same thing, and so von Clausewitz says that in this last phrase, fundamentally, that there is always a measure of demonstrated evidence in war. Like, you don't go out there literally knowing literally nothing about what's going on. You always have some information, aside from yourself, of course, but also on the enemy. But at the same time, it's plenty of things you don't know. So war, naturally, in this, also has a variable that is time, that helps to assess the situation. And but this time is not always given. This time also still produces that kind of makes you self-indulgent, tendentially, instinctively, saying, okay, I have time, so I can't procrastinate, and that is damaging at the same time. Or at least you should have a good reason for procrastinating at that point, because maybe some data from intelligence and so on, it's particularly useful and can make really the difference in the outcome of that action. But it varies. So, and what you do in war is always calculating these odds at every level. And what we will see with von Clausewitz is that war in this always poses the same problem. There are always unsolvable problems. There are always data. There is always data that can't be known at its fullest. But through experience and through knowing how certain things work, you can start kind of calculate certain what the odds are, more or less realistically. And this is fundamentally how military analysis is done. You have certain given evidence, you have to calculate how things can go. And naturally, war, and this is also what von Clausewitz says, that war is probably the field in which the expectation is kind of more different from the results. So this is also particularly meaningful. This has naturally much to do also with the fact that you are acting against a reacting force, that is the one of the enemy, that is not just a passive object, but it kind of can take the initiative, can start becoming dangerous on even actively. So that is one thing, but it's also related to your ability of knowing what's going on. So what we were telling before about the boldness, fundamentally, of the general is something that on a greater scale naturally goes at, it can go also at a smaller scale. But the soldier that is maybe in the first line, he has to assess whether his enemies can be shot at in that moment, where he has to keep his head down, or all that stuff. But it gets at a much wider level, also at a political level, for instance, at a social level. I mean, there is an awareness at that point. It is not just the one of the general, but it is also the one of the politician. It's also the one of the people, and all these elements influence each other. So this should really bring to confusion into your mind, because that's what von Clausewitz is telling you, that if you try to figure out what the solution is in a kind of scientifical fashion, you probably will not. It's not really time wasted, because part of your task is to figure something out in this sense. But at the same time, in order to figure something out, it's better to understand, to paradoxically, to get rid of the expectancy of figuring everything out correctly, and instead starting by concentrating on the dynamics of war, how they generally happen, and how that are actually rather simple in themselves. You see that von Clausewitz is always using very very simple dichotomies. There is always a in fact a polar system. We have seen how polarity is brought into requisition into real war, but let's say that this is the extremes towards which real war swings are, in fact, a polar. But the problem is that this polarity is framed in too many other poles, so many that at that point you have to have better a plastic vision of the whole reality rather than focusing on those poles. But it's just good for you to know that there are these reciprocities that are always in act, like just in attacking and defense, in this example that is just made of, having more or less time. So these are all variables that intervene, but are more than variables, because the real variable is really the actual time you're given in a given action. Here it's beyond. Here it's about the range of those variables, which is way more important, because it really makes you cover the whole spectrum of possibilities that may happen. Not really knowing them one by one in detail, but just being aware that in this reality lots of things can happen. And it can be very confusing to understand how they do and what the result that will occur. So these are very, very important things to bear in mind. At the end of the day, it wasn't so difficult to explain this. I hope I've been effective. Actually, I believe that when I explain von Clausewitz, when I comment on it, I'm terrible, because I'm just trying to make some to formulate some sensible phrases, and in the meanwhile I just make and I don't think that I express myself very effectively, but I hope that at least the essentials are clear. And especially one, that is that you have to abandon any scientificity in figuring out war, and this is valid also in or better, scientificity, let's say the scientific method is always to be used, but by itself it's insufficient to understand war. And the point is that war can't be understood in this sense. You can't really know, just like reality, because war is just a part of reality, and there is no border to this. It's just characterized as an act of violence, but there are so many other acts. So the complexity of reality applies to war at the point that you effectively can't know what's going on most of the times fully. And that's why also military history is particularly difficult, because many people approach it trying to make sense of it, simplifying it by saying, okay, we have this data and this is what probably happened. But the truth is that most of the times we don't really know, and that even the most, some of the best documented military actions always have this, gray area in which you don't really know what happened, and it's practically impossible to know. So you have to develop some other skills that, in this sense, are not just scientific, but they have to be based on experience, that will build up a series of general rules that are not laws, but are kind of the norm in war, and that's why also, in order to command, you are favorable. I mean, our problem, at least I believe personally, I'm not a military man, but it's not just a problem of the civilian that wants to understand how an army is, I don't know, led, is actually led on the field, and how it works, etc. But it's also but doesn't effectively know many things because it's never led an army, doesn't know what problems are there. But it's also a problem of the military, because the military has to study military history as well, because, and this is, well, okay, this opens to a huge parenthesis that I will have to, dedicate another video to, because it's enormous. But let's be honest, the military history today is actually way better understood by military historians and by military men. And I know many of you will be outraged by such statement, but I can assure you it's the real truth. And this is not defending my category, towards which we're even too few to pretend we're a sort of category on our own. I'm just stating it because it is the truth. The way the military is taught these topics is just very, very. It's just like a synthesis to, and most that they're trained to do, they're educated to do, are to make things work, kind of practically speaking. But there is, a further stage, a higher level at which, in fact, officers of the higher ranks rise for that exact reason. That is going beyond this, and also having learned military history helps dramatically into this. And von Clausewitz is a perfect example of this, because he definitely learned the military art way before, or at least, however, the harder way, before learning military history. But what he wrote in the Vom Krige is the product of both things, and it could have not been otherwise, because there is no ability in command if you don't have a progressed military experience that you can impart, and also in terms of military logic and strategic culture that can be acquired also through, and especially through, the experience of wars that you may have not fought. In fact, we're talking about the wars that were fought in the past, in the history of mankind, that provide us with very valuable information on how to conduct a war, and then, in fact, leading a war, commanding. Because without that, it's not impossible, but it's very, very rare to be good commanders. As a matter of fact, it's like a bit like trainers in sports. Like, there are usually trainers are ex sportsmen, but there are a very few trainers that actually never practiced that sport, but kind of grew, they studied it and kind of got good at even training athletes and so on. So that's a bit like in war. And now we're digressing, so I will cut it short now with it. But these are things that are not merely anecdotal, and we will have to discuss them sometimes. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.